All rise.
The Kosovo Specialist Chambers is now in session.
Be seated. Mr. Court Officer, you may call the case.
Good morning, Your Honors. This is the file number case CBC 2020-06, the Specialist Prosecutor versus Hashim Thaçi, Kadri Veselier, Recep Selimi, and Jakub Krsniki. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you. I note the accused are all present in court today. Now we will continue hearing the evidence of prosecution witness W04752. Before we do that, Mr. Emerson, can you update us on the time remaining in your cross-examination?
I expect to be finished by the 11 o'clock break.
Thank you. Could I have an update from you last two in the back?
Yes, Your Honour. At the moment, I think my estimate is 6 hours. It's probably come down, and I've made efforts to do so. I think it's probably closer to around 5 now, but we'll see how things go in relation to the rest of Mr. Emerson's cross, and also obviously the beginning of my questions as well.
Mr. Ellis, or Ms. Alejandra?
Your Honours, we've initially indicated 8 hours, and then we have come down to 6.5 hours. But looking at the additional evidence that was adduced, we may need to revert back to our original estimates.
Thank you. Madam Usher, you may bring the witness in. Good morning, Mr. Zarapi and duty counsel.
Mirma Jesse.
Good morning.
Clearly with short answers this morning. If you don't understand a question, feel free to ask counsel to repeat the question or tell them you don't understand and they will clarify. Also, please try to indicate the basis of your knowledge of facts and circumstances upon which you will be questioned. Please also speak into the microphone and wait 5 seconds before answering a question, and then speak at a slow pace for the interpreters to catch up. If you feel the need to take breaks, please make an indication and an accommodation will be made. If you feel the need, I remind you that if you are still under an obligation to tell the truth, as stated by you in your solemn declaration. I also remind you that that as advised last week, you are not required to answer a question that is incriminating unless and until the panel compels you to answer. And if such a question arises, you or your assigned counsel may raise the issue to the panel, and we will proceed to determine whether or not and under what circumstances you might be compelled to answer. We continue now, I should say, with the cross-examination by the Vasily defense. Please give Mr. Emerson your attention.
Good morning, Mr. Zarapi.
Mirëmëngjesi.
Good morning.
When we broke yesterday morning, or yesterday lunchtime, I had just read to you some passages from a witness statement signed and provided by Mensur Kusumi. You remember, broadly speaking, the passages that I read to you?
Po,
Yes.
Some follow-up questions based or relating to the description that Mr. Kusumi gave of his appointment and his role. Now, first of all, do I understand the position correctly that prior to the arrival of Mensur Kusumi, there was nobody deputizing or doing anything in relation to intelligence at the general staff level whilst Mr. Vasily was out of the country?
po,
Yes.
Could we look, please, at P182 and at page SPOE 00226401 within that page range? Now, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but this is dated the 6th of February and is a comment recorded in a meeting attended by Rustam Mustafa and is attributed earlier in the notes to Rustam Mustafa. So the complaint, we talked about that meeting and various complaints that were being made in relation to the relationship between the general staff and the zone commanders. The specific complaint being raised here was that the intelligence service can't look after the army from abroad. It's just the first line there. You see that?
po, po.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
That complaint being made.
Ankesa ka parë çdo herë.
There were numerous complaints. I can't recall this one in particular, but complaints there were, yeah.
but specifically complaints about it being impossible to run an intelligence service from abroad. You remember lots of complaints about that, or lots of complaints about other things?
Zakonisht komandanti kur ka
The commanders, whenever they came up to report, they had lots of complaints, not only on this aspect, but on other issues having to do with provisions, the personnel, and so on and so forth. There were numerous complaints, in fact.
This one, we know, was made on the first day of Rambouillet, when Mr. Vasili was undoubtedly in Rambouillet. And so I'm asking you in relation to that, whether there were complaints being voiced to you about the absence of an intelligence service operative inside Kosovo.
po.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly when Mensur Kasumi joined the General Staff, isn't it? It's about a week after he joined the General Staff in the Operations Department.
Departamentin pa
It's not a week since he joined the operations department, but a lot more than that. But the picture is accurate, yes.
Forgive me, but you told the SPO, I think, in your most recent interviews, that Mensur Kasumi arrived at the General Staff at the end of January or the beginning of February. Is that right?
po qartë.
That's correct.
In the sequence, the 6th of February. So it is about the time that he, or shortly after he joined. Would you agree?
Është vërtet.
Yes, and according to this note and the meeting that was held, it appears to be the case, yes.
Understood correctly, the evidence that you gave yesterday, and it was right at the very end of the session, so I think your answer was slightly cut off. But I think what you were saying yesterday, at the end of the very end of the transcript, was that though he had been appointed to the operations department, the need to gather, for example, intelligence about targeting of Serbian forces meant that he was performing some intelligence functions. That's correct?
Po sakt.
Yes, correct.
Formally and wasn't formally appointed as the replacement for Mr. Vasili until the beginning of April. He was, I think you said, still performing some intelligence functions, correct? Prior to his formal appointment.
Po sakt është.
Yes, that is correct.
Heard me read to you his witness statement that essentially his intelligence functions involved gathering as much information as he could about potential Serb targets. Correct?
Po sakt.
And would he
Yes, that's right.
you?
Po.
He would, yes.
Just summarize, or rather, let me put it to you this way. I'm going to suggest that there are three broad categories of intelligence that were relevant in relation to your time on the General Staff. One is incoming intelligence from foreign intelligence services or foreign representatives coming into Kosovo through outside contacts. The second is general information about troop movements of the Serbs, of positions and placements and so on, which could go outwards or remain within Kosovo, depending on the circumstances. In other words, information gathered on the ground about legitimate military targets and Serb positions. That's the second type of information, I suggest. And the third, you described it in your evidence last week, is information about spies within the army, spies in uniform, and spies not in uniform, correct?
Okyard.
Yes, all correct.
And you were asked in that context about the definition of collaborators, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but you told the court that for your purposes, the definition of collaborators was restricted to somebody who was actively collaborating and contributing to the information available to the enemy forces.
Pohsakt.
Yes, correct.
In Mr. Kasumi's witness statement, as you see, he says far and away the most important and in effect the only priority that he was able to grapple with was trying to get information about Serb positions. Now, I want you to focus on that for a moment. When he was reporting to you in that period, was he reporting anything other than Serb positions? In other words, did Mr. Kasumi report to you about collaborators within the army or outside the army during that time or not? Let me put it, the question is a bit of a long and compound question. You saw in Mr. Kasumi's witness statement that he describes his intelligence function as being effectively limited to gathering what information he could gather about Serbian positions. You remember that part of his statement?
Po.
Yes.
Is that correct as far as you're concerned?
Po, on što je sakt.
Yes, it is correct that Mr. Kasumi informed me only about the movements of Serbian forces.
Because do you remember the transcript that you looked at during the questions that were being asked to you by the prosecution, where one of the people on the end of the line was called Luli, but it wasn't Mr. Vasily, it was somebody whose real name was Luli and a subordinate. Do you remember that?
Po.
Yes.
You're also desperately trying to get information, it seems, about troop positions and military action, which involved waking people up in the middle of the night. Do you remember that?
Po, Okyard.
Yes, it's correct. However, there's a differentiation between the conversations I had with Luli, the individual who was from the LAP operational zone, that occurred on the occasions when I wanted information from him at the time when there was fighting between the Serbian forces and the KLA forces. When we're talking about the gathering of Serbian forces, that is another type of information that has to do with the movements of those forces, which locations they are being deployed, where they are moving to, what weaponry they are carrying. So there is a difference between that kind of report and this other one.
But nonetheless, you're obtaining information about movements on the ground, sometimes yourself, in direct communication with commanders on the ground. Is that right? I mean, the intercept was a little later. It was.
Your Honor, classification, please.
I wasn't going to call it up, just a date. Is the date classified?
It's not the date, it's the description, Your Honor.
We'll go into private session for this.
Your Honors, we are in public session. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So, if we go back to the document on the screen, did the complaints you said you'd received about the intelligence service being unable to look after the army from abroad, did that have anything to do with the reason why you asked Mr. Kasumi to operate in that function until Mr. Vasili returned?
Nuk ka veç ka arsye
That is not the only reason, as reflected in this note. With the arrival of Mr. Kasumi to the General Staff, I gave him the additional task to gather information within the G2 or the intelligence unit, because there was no one else who would be able to carry out that task, and owing to the fact that he had experience in the field, and that was until the arrival of Mr. Vasili, when the changes were made, the result of which was the move of Mr. Vasili from the military side onto the civilian side of intelligence gathering, and others continued serving in that capacity within the General Staff. But for the time we are concentrating on, the time from January when Kasumi came to the General Staff headquarters, in addition to the Operations Department, he carried out this task too. And that was because of the fact that there was no one else, simply no one else to be able to carry out that task. At least as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Vasili had never indicated to me that there was someone else who would be able to carry out those tasks, and that is the reason why he was given that assignment. There were other requests made too during that time. Commanders did make frequent requests for that matter.
But it was you that assigned him to those tasks?
Po.
Yes.
So just to be clear about this, because you told us yesterday about the similarity between the words successor in Albanian and the word deputy. In point of fact, as Mr. Kasumi says in his witness statement, he didn't meet Mr. Vasili until he came back in March. That's his recollection. That's the first time Mr. Kasumi remembers meeting Mr. Vasili. Now, you say that Mr. Vasili was back in Kosovo for 2 days, either at the end of February or the beginning of March. Could you be mistaken about that or not? Is that possibly a mistaken recollection?
Mund të gaboj në
I could be mistaken about dates, but not about periods of time. I've said that it was end of January, beginning of February, in this period. So it can be end of January or beginning of February. During that period, he was there for 2 days and left again for abroad. He went abroad to Albania and continued on to Rambouillet with the delegation. This is how I remember it and how it was at that time.
But not with the delegation from Kosovo?
jo.
No.
Can we look, in the light of that evidence about the role that you ascribed to Mr. Kasumi, can we look, please, at an earlier meeting, when we know that Mr. Vasili was not in the country, on the 30th of December, because we've got stamps in the passport. So it's P1109 at page U002-2861. We have the Albanian, yes, on the left, please. And the and we're looking for page 2861 on both documents. Don't think that's correct. Yes, so that's the page. If we could just zoom out a little bit to get the full page on the screen. I think we need to zoom back a bit. Yes. Now, this is a meeting, or rather a record, an agenda for a meeting about including Mr. Well, it's about the composition, first of all, the proposals for the Personnel Commission. You've already told us that never went forward, the Personnel Commission. But what I'm interested in is item C. If we could now just focus in on item C to the bottom of the page. But bear in mind, this is dated 30th of December, 1998. C is described as the Commission for the Delineation of Operational Zones. And as we can see, Salih Vasili's name is mentioned, and then Intelligence Service, brackets, deputy, close brackets, I apologize, Kadri's deputy, Intelligence Service Kadri's deputy, but nobody seems to know who Kadri's deputy is, because whilst others are named, he is not. And then we see to the in the scribbling on the side, the name Luli and what is a Swiss-coded telephone number. If there was no deputy, obviously nobody would know who the deputy was. Do you remember the discussion and somebody suggesting that it would be necessary to call Mr. Vasili in Switzerland to find out if he had a deputy, and if so, who it was?
I remember the meeting very well, but we have to explain some things. First of all, the Personnel Council was formed, but the ranking one was not. So I want to be clear on this. Secondly, it is true what is written here, that is, that the Delineation Commission to be assigned by the deputy of Kadri. There was no deputy. The Luli, aka, is there, which is Kadri Veseli's pseudonym. I see the number. I do not recall whose this number it was and who discussed the number. But as for the meeting, I remember it very well.
Well, that's very helpful as far as it can be. I mean, we know that it's a Swiss number. Does that help at all as to whose it might be?
Shumë sakt po shifrat në shkrim.
Well, you can see it clearly that it is a Swiss number, and that below that number we read Luli, so it can be his number.
Just give you one moment. Can we turn now, please, to just give me a second. I do apologise. I misplaced my note. I'd like to just, I'm afraid some of my questions now will be out of chronological order, but perhaps you could just bear with me on that. Could we call up 1D00029 and its ET, please? This again was a document that was shown to you by counsel for the prosecution. It's the same reference, but with ET. The number, if it helps, is SPOE 00119161. That's its original number. If that helps.
Thank you so much. If a counsel can specify if it's within Veseli's team, PQ, or any other.
It's in the SPO queue.
Thank you. Yeah, I can confirm that I'm able to find only the Albanian version of this document. I'll proceed with trying to find it.
If I may, it may be an RQ. I know I used it in cross-examination in English.
I mean, both prosecution and Thaçi defence have used it in questioning. In English.
I didn't use it, just to be clear.
You did not. Okay, my apologies. So I'm being informed that although prosecution counsel didn't use the document, it is in the prosecution's queue at item 216.
The item 216 in the SPOQ is the SPOE 00119161 to SPOE 00119161 ET, admitted as P00741-ET.3.
That's the document.
Okay. I understood that the 1D00029 was called.
It's a prosecution exhibit.
Now, you were asked some questions about items number 4 to 7. Just for the purposes of the record, this is the order, which is dated the 28th of November and signed by you as Chief of Staff. And the first preamble talks about measures that are necessary, in particular disciplinary and penal measures to stamp out negative phenomena. And then item 1 and 2 and 3, I suggest, are concerned with prevention, whereas items 4, 5, 6 and 7, or 6 at least, are concerned with punishment. But we didn't look at item 1. So if we can just go through that. Zone commanders are to increase checks, engaging members of the command, police units, commanders, to immediately stamp out the negative phenomenon and abuse against persons and private property. Number 2, the engagement and mobilization of material assets and confiscation without an order or without the permission of a zone commander are prohibited. And 3, improper behavior towards the civilian population is to be prevented in all KLA units. And then we move on to disciplinary and penal measures, including a reference to the court system that Sokol de Bruyne, you've told us, was to be setting up. Now, you've told us your definition of collaborators in terms of intelligence. Did you learn from zone commanders that there were rogue individuals within their zones who were abusing that term from time to time?
Yes, there were such complaints.
Was the order issued at the request of the zone commanders, or was it issued? Was it to give them the authority to take the steps they needed to take at their request, or was it? Did the initiative come from you?
This order was issued. This order was issued in cooperation with the commander. At his initiative, there were complaints from commanders, but also from civilians in those areas. So complaints were coming from all sides, and that's why it was decided to issue this order, to send it to the zone commanders so that they can discipline their respective commands, their soldiers, in terms of their conduct and behavior towards the civilians, so that the commands could have complete control over the territory, and the soldiers of their respective areas not to enter other areas and engage in improper behavior with civilians. So this was the purpose of this order.
And amongst the sort of report you would get would be somebody who worked as a woodcutter, for example, or in some other civilian capacity for the Serbian authorities, or private grudges being settled. Is that right?
Well, we can say from all sides. There were people who behaved in that way on purpose, and there were people who misused their authority for personal grudges that dated back before the war. So that is why this order was issued to put an end to this phenomenon. There was a truce at the time, and we wanted to show the internationals that we were a disciplined army, that our aim was to liberate Kosovo, and that the army was taking such measures to discipline its ranks and to achieve its ultimate goal.
Do know for certain is that at the time you issued this order, apart from a short period in early November, Mr. Vasili was out of the country in September, October, from the 19th of November all the way through to, you say, the 2 days when he returned at the end of January, correct? So if there were people misusing the term collaborator or ill-treating those that they had in custody, is that something that was authorised or in any way permitted at general staff level?
There were several questions in this question. First of all, it is true Mr. Veseli was not there during this period. Secondly, yes, action was taken. Brigade commanders had this responsibility to act upon this in their respective zone. In at a zone level, later on, it was planned for such measures to be taken and to engage the legal sector.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to go back to the period shortly after your arrival now. First of all, do you remember, well, put it a different way, did you know in advance that the announcement was to be made on the 10th and 11th of June, that Jakub Krasniqi was going to become the spokesperson for the KLA? Did you know in advance? At that time, I think you said you had not a formal position on the general staff, but had just arrived on the 28th of May, so 2 weeks after your arrival. Did you know in advance that that announcement of Jakub Krasniqi was going to be made, or did it take you by surprise?
Jo, nuk e kam ditur.
I didn't know that in advance, that Jakub Krasniqi would become the spokesperson, but if you've read my statement carefully, in June I met in Licoț with Mr. Krasniqi once he took this position. But I didn't know in advance. I learned that he became the deputy of the general staff at Licoț later.
So I'm focusing on his role, the announcement, public announcement of his role as the spokesperson, which we know was made on the 10th in Political Declaration number 3, but circulated on the 11th. And I want to put to you a very specific recollection that Mr. Vasili has of the circumstances in which you came to learn of that, and see if it jogs your memory.
Excuse me, Mr. Emerson. Ms. Alessandra has a question.
Yeah, and I believe there is a transcript error at lines 15 or 16. He doesn't say deputy of the general staff. I'm told he said spokesperson. Can that be corrected, please?
Yes, did you for the first time say deputy or spokesperson on the first occasion?
Unë tash me zëvendës. Jo zëvendës, po zëvendës.
I said spokesperson, not deputy.
That's exactly what I wanted to focus on, that announcement, and those are the dates for that announcement. Now, I want to put to you a very specific recollection of Mr. Vasili's, that the two of you were en route to visit Ramesh Haradinaj when that announcement was made. Do you remember visiting Ramesh Haradinaj at around that time with Mr. Vasili?
Nuk më kujtohet.
I don't remember. Do you mean June, beginning of June?
Round about the 11th, 12th.
Jo, nuk më kujtohet.
No, I don't remember.
A meeting with Ramesh Haradinaj in which he reacted rather badly to the appointment of Jakub Krasniqi as spokesperson.
Po, ky takim ka qenë në korrik.
Yes, but this meeting was in July.
Do you remember a meeting in Jabal?
Po.
Yes.
That meeting which is different from the one that you've told us about at Jablanica. Is that correct?
Po.
Yes, correct.
That you mentioned was in July.
Po saktë.
I'm going.
Correct.
Do you remember an earlier meeting than that in Jabel with Mr. Haradinaj when he exploded with anger that this announcement had been made without consultation with the zone commanders?
Po.
Yes. I remember that he exploded, but I don't remember when, on which date.
Would that be a convenient moment?
We'll take a 10-minute break at this time, as has been our practice. Mr. Zarapi, you can leave the courtroom with the usher. We'll be adjourned for 10 minutes.
All rise.
Be seated. Madam Usher, please bring the witness in. All right, Mr. Zarapi, Mr. Emerson will continue with his cross-examination.
I just want to go back to the questions I was asking you a moment ago. Does the name Skender Saluka mean something to you?
The name, yes. The surname doesn't.
Apologise. Have I mispronounced the surname? Could you give me what you think the correct name that I'm trying to say is?
Skender Salauka.
You think Skender Salauka?
So, Skender Salauka, do you remember visiting Ramesh Haradinaj with Skender Salauka as the driver and Mr. Vasily with you?
Po, më kujto.
Yes, I do remember.
Some further details to you to see if it helps you at all to place the timing. Mr. Haradinaj was complaining, I suggest, about the fact that this information had just been made public and he hadn't been told about it in advance or even consulted, and he didn't know who Jakub Krasniqi was or why he had been given that authority, first of all. Does that ring a bell?
Po.
Yes.
And threats were made because the Dukagjin region had a special significance for logistics. I think you've already confirmed, because that was the route through which weapons would be smuggled from Albania. Is that correct?
Po.
Yes.
I threatened to block the logistics route because he was so angry, and had to be reassured that Mr. Krasniqi was well known to Lahi Brahimi, or Smile, Mr. Haradinaj's cousin, and then he gradually simmered down a bit.
Po, saktë është.
It's all correct, yes.
And after the meeting, if this helps, just give me a second. You stayed the night in that area with Mr. Vasily and were then back in Drenica, in Negrots, at the time that Mr. Krasniqi's press interview, took place. Do you remember being at Mr. Krasniqi's television appearance, or recording of his television video, announcing his appointment in Negrots?
Po, më kujtohet.
Yes, I remember being at Negrots.
That the announcement was made on the 11th, and that the filming in Negrots was on the 13th of June. Those are objective, proven facts that help perhaps us to locate in relation to timing. And do you remember, I think you've confirmed this, that Mr. Haradinaj was exploding because he had only just heard the news?
Po, është saktë.
Yes, it's correct.
So let me pause just for 1 second here and ask you about the very first time you encountered Ramesh Haradinaj, which wasn't in Kosovo at all. I suggest it was in Tirana in April. Do you remember meeting Mr. Haradinaj in Tirana in April?
Po.
Yes.
Talked in substance to you. He said to you something along the lines of, we'll talk when you get into Kosovo, but I'm not talking to people outside Kosovo. Do you remember that?
Po, saktë është ashtu.
Yes, that's what it was like.
You were keen to meet him to show you were in Kosovo, is that right?
Po, kështu është.
Yes, it is.
Again, I'm going to put to you, in the light of the fact we know that the statement was made public on the 11th, and that the filming took place, I think I said in the Grots, but in Klečka on the 13th, that the meeting you had in Glojan with Ramesh Haradine must have been on the 11th, 12th. It must have been.
Very likely. I cannot recall the date exactly.
You confirmed that you spent the night in the Dukajin area.
Yes.
Let me move on to just a couple of final issues. First of all, in your SPO interviews, and we don't need to call this up, and it's not in the queue anyway, but you were asked, and this is part 10, pages 10 and 11, you were asked whether you recalled any instance in which Kadri Vasili had ever told you about an individual collaborator that had been or was due to be arrested, and you replied that he hadn't. Can I ask you to confirm, please, that you never heard Mr. Vasili at any time reporting to you on any individual collaborator within Kosovo?
Yes, it's correct.
And that passage was refined for those following and for the record at paragraph 19 of the first proofing note, where you've corrected some of the other details, but that proposition remains correct.
It is correct.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts?
Thank you, Your Honour. If you just bear with me for 1 minute.
Certainly.
Good morning, Mr. Zarapi. My name is Jeff Roberts. I'm counsel for Mr. Salimi, and I have questions for the rest of today and probably well into tomorrow. I know you've obviously been giving evidence for several days already, so I hope you're still fit and well, but obviously if you need any breaks, as the presiding judge this morning mentioned, please feel free to let me know. At least for the initial questions, I think a lot of them refer to parts of previous evidence that you've given, so I think a lot of it can be confirmed with a yes or a no, or obviously a yes or no if you disagree, but hopefully it should be relatively quick. And obviously if any questions at any time are unclear, please do let me know, and I'm happy to rephrase them. So I hope all of that's clear.
Yes. Good morning. It's all clear.
And also, I'll try and go chronologically, at least initially, so that that's easy to follow as well. So starting off, when exactly did you arrive into Albania in 1998?
sin aspekt shkuan nga
Do you mean from Kosovo to Albania, or what?
You arrived in Albania in I believe, somewhere around March, but just wondered if you knew exactly when you arrived.
po në Shqip
I reached Albania from the west in March. It was mid-March, I think. I cannot recall the exact date, though.
You were first in Albania. Your responsibility was to train those individuals, both coming from the diaspora, from other countries, but also those who had come from Kosovo into Albania for training. Is that right?
po sakt.
That's correct.
Training for people who'd never had any military service, any military training at all. Is that correct?
Po qartë, ashtu është.
Yes, it is.
Who you were training, had any of them carried out their military service in the JNA or not?
Zakonisht ata që janë trajnuar
Usually, the ones trained in Albania were amongst those who'd never had any military training. People who had no knowledge whatsoever about military matters.
And due to the circumstances at the time, the training that you were able to give, that would often only last a few weeks, wouldn't it? Rather than the necessary months that you would be expected to do in a more regular army, if I can put it that way.
po sakt ashtu.
Yes, correct.
Actually, why could you only train for a few weeks? What was the reason that you couldn't do it for longer?
Nuk mund të zhvilloj më
There are a number of reasons why it couldn't take any longer. The first is that at the time we did not have the ability to use a military base for the training, a fully supplied and equipped base, that is. So most of the activities were of an illegal nature. Secondly, we did not want large groups of people coming from the West to be too visible. So the aim was to train them very quickly and dispatch them into Kosovo or have them return. So these were some of the reasons why we aimed to have curtailed training so that people would be able to learn to use a weapon and to get knowledge, basic knowledge about the movements and deployments of troops and so on.
It was very basic training, and you had the incentive to send them into Kosovo as soon as possible to conduct the war that had, or to start fighting at least. And all of these were volunteers, weren't they?
po të gjithë.
Yes, all.
Have left at any time during that training to go back to their home countries or anywhere else if they wanted to.
Po, është e qartë.
Yes, that's right.
Actually, did some people start training and then decide it wasn't for them and then return home?
Po ka pasur të tillë.
There were some, yes.
And obviously nothing you could do about it if they wanted to turn around and go home. There was no ability to stop them that you had.
Jo.
There wasn't. It was out of their own free will.
They went home.
Po tash dikush nga
Some had health issues. Some just couldn't cope. Not everyone is the same. The willpower might be there, but the ability is something else.
by those who were coming over for training that there wasn't quite the weapons that they hoped there would be, or facilities, or other logistics that they were hoping for when they came over?
Yes, there were other groups who dealt with the question of supplies of weaponry and so on and so forth, and they found what they could, took those weapons and returned to Kosovo.
I get told off by the interpreters for not pausing. To be clear, you did have limitations on the amount of weapons and uniforms that were available to you at that time. Is that correct?
Yes, there were limitations on everything, not only on weapons and uniforms. So we didn't have them in numbers large enough. Some of them were to be obtained by the infantry in Albania. On other occasions, we bought the stuff in other countries where the possibilities were. Regardless of it, there were a number of limitations for the transport of them from overseas to Albania and from Albania to Kosovo. In addition, the financial ability was not there for us to be able to procure the uniforms or the weapons that would be necessary to equip a soldier deployed on the ground.
Clear, these limitations that you've described, they continued obviously at least up until when you went to Kosovo on the 28th of May. Is that correct?
Yes, the limitations remained until we entered Kosovo. The limitations continued onwards, but they were not as severe as they were at the time when I first arrived.
We'll talk about...
Excuse me just a moment. My transcript is frozen.
Of course, Your Honor.
Daniel, maybe take a look at this. Yours are both. Yeah, okay. Just mine. You may go ahead, sorry.
Thank you, Your Honor, no problem. And just to be clear, it was actually, as you told the trial chamber in Haradinaj, you were responsible for checking the type and quality of the weapons. That was one of your roles as well, wasn't it, in Albania in April '98?
Yes, correct.
And that was quite an important task, I presume. Obviously, you didn't want to get sold a whole load of weapons that were defective and not up to the task. Sorry, if you could just say yes or no for the record. I see you nodding your head, but if you could just answer.
I think he's waiting for you to stop and then for the translation to stop.
You may be right, Your Honor.
Yeah. Yes, it's all clear.
Following directions better than you are.
He's not the first, Your Honor, and I doubt he'll be the last. So you're undertaking training, you're inspecting weapons, and I think you told the Haradinaj trial chamber that you had about 300 recruits that passed through during that time between mid-March and the end of May. Is that correct, that you trained?
Po.
Yes.
Given those tasks largely because of your previous military experience in Bosnia. Is that right?
To përgjegjësimi ka ndonë për
These responsibilities were given to me owing to my experience, and that is not confined to my service in Bosnia, but also to the military training that I'd had before and the education.
To check exactly what that is. So my understanding is that you were born in 1962 in Suareka, but you went to military school in Sarajevo in 1977. Is that right?
po, kështu është.
Yes, that's right.
Stay in Sarajevo from that period onwards up until 1995, or did you move somewhere else?
Deri
I finished my secondary school from 77 to 1981. From 1981 to 1986, I worked at Sarajevo, then at the military academy in Belgrade. Then I returned to Sarajevo, where I served in the same unit, and that continued until the beginning of the war in Bosnia, after which I joined the Bosnian army, and until January 1995, I stayed in Sarajevo in Bosnia.
And so in the Bosnian army, can you just confirm the positions that you held?
në ushtrim Boshaku.
I was a brigade commander in the Bosnian army. At the end, I was commander of the infantry division.
And is that the infantry division within the general staff or the main staff of the Bosnian army? Is that right?
Jo.
No, the division was within the 7th Army of the Bosnian Armed Forces, the 3rd Corps. In fact, it became the 7th Corps of the Bosnian Armed Forces of the time.
But you did have knowledge and experience of how the Bosnian army functioned, including the main staff of that army. Is that right?
Po.
Yes, that's right.
A bit more of that later, but just to be clear, so by March of 1998, when you came to Albania, you'd been living outside of Kosovo for 20 years, give or take, since 1977.
Po, sakt.
That's correct.
Now, before going to Albania, did you personally know many other members of the KLA who were in Kosovo and fighting for the KLA?
Kam njohur, po jo në
I did, but not people who lived in Kosovo. It was people who were living in the West.
Okay. And at this stage, I think you told the court in Haradinaj that at this point in April 98, you were neither in the KLA or out of it, but yet you were being trusted to conduct training. Is that right?
po.
Yes.
And obviously the weapons inspection that we talked about earlier. And you were together with some other experienced military soldiers in Albania conducting this training, weren't you?
Po.
Yes.
It may sound trite, but what you were doing at that stage, those 2 months, was fundamentally important, wasn't it?
Po.
Correct, yes.
Provided training to these individuals, they really wouldn't have had a clue what to do when entering Kosovo. Is that fair?
Po, shumë shkurtër e qartë.
Yes, it's all clear and correct.
You mentioned various individuals who you were with at the time, and I believe those were Kadri Kastrati, Kamal Shachiri, Mahir Hassani, and Shaban Dragai. They were all present with you in Albania at the time, is that right?
Jo, në atë kohë në Shqipëri,
No, Kemal Shakir and Shaban Dragai were not there in Albania during March and April. Kadri Kasrati was there, Agim Chela too, Agim Nagashi, Mahir Hassani, Suni Ahmeti, Mensur Kasumi. This was the group of people who were involved in the training of the soldiers who had volunteered, and those volunteers came from the west as well as from inside Kosovo.
The SPO, and also you've mentioned in some previous statements that you had to wait in Albania before entering Kosovo at the end of May. Do you recall that evidence?
po.
Yes.
You told the Haradinaj trial chamber that you needed approval from the general staff for former officers of the JNA before entering the country. Is that right?
Po, kështu.
Yes, that's right.
Were you specifically told this, or was this something you deduced or assumed? How did you come by that information?
Këto informacion në kanë dhënë atëherë prej.
We got this information from KLA members and from people who were in Tirana at the time.
And this process, it obviously took a bit of time. Did you complain at the time that it was taking too long?
Po, disa.
Yes, several times.
So you were obviously keen to get into Kosovo to put your experience and knowledge to good use.
Po, sakt.
Yes, that's correct.
If you can just clarify for me, and I think it was raised slightly earlier, but I wasn't quite sure of the answer. Did you know already in May that you were going to be going over to work for what was called the Operations Directorate of the General Staff? Was that something you knew already in Albania, or was that something you found out later on?
Jo, këto e kom ditë kur.
I learned this when I entered Kosovo.
And would you allow for the possibility that it was envisaged that you would join the General Staff, even if you weren't informed? And so that's why there was a necessity to conduct a more extensive vetting process for you. Is that reasonable?
Po, ishte periudhë.
Yes, we were waiting.
And obviously your absence from Kosovo for the preceding 20 years meant that you didn't necessarily know so many people within the country who could give information about you as well. Is that also fair?
Po.
Yes.
And I think you told the chamber on the 3rd of July that it was Azam Zula who eventually gave you the green light to enter Kosovo and gave you instructions. Is that right?
Po.
Yes.
And what instructions were they?
Po në atë kohë kur fol
At the time when he gave us instructions, he told us that who the members of the staff were and who would go to the staff in Kosovo, which tasks and duties they were going to take up to behave and conduct in professional manner, to do our work and to work together with the boys who were inside Kosovo. Everything was clear. There was no specific instruction or task that he gave us.
Just to complete this process of you getting into to Kosovo, you mentioned in response to a question from Mr. Emerson earlier an incident with Mr. Haradinaj in April 1998 when I believe was characterized, he suggested that you either get into Kosovo or get lost, in very simple terms.
po, ashtu është.
Yes, that's right.
Reflect, in your understanding, a frustration from those who were inside Kosovo fighting, that you had these individuals, such as yourself and the others that you mentioned, who had military experience and were not being necessarily able to come over to Kosovo at that stage?
Po, përshtypja ka qenë shumë e qartë.
Yes, it was clear because those of us who had the experience were in Tirana, and those who were inside Kosovo and who were doing the fighting, they were waiting for people like us. So this was the frustration amongst them.
Yes, they were impatient for you to come and help them out, were they not?
Po sakt.
Yes, correct.
And during this time, you explained, I think, to the Haradinaj trial chamber that you had no concrete information about what was really going on in the fighting in Kosovo at the time. You knew it was happening, but you didn't know specifically what was happening. Is that right?
Po, kështu është.
Yes, that's right.
And so is it also fair to say that you didn't really know what the structure of any KLA forces or points or units was in Kosovo before your entry into the country?
Po, sakt është.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, if we can move now into when you did enter into Kosovo, and I know some of this has been covered in passing before, but please bear with me and I'll try and go through it as quickly as possible. Now, you've obviously testified before in other cases. Now, you described in Limaj in the Limaj case at the ICTY, the situation as you found it at the end of 1998, and confirmed this in the Haradinaj trial. For the record, this is Haradinaj transcript page 3275 to 3276, and you're talking about the Dukazhin and Drenica zones. And you said these two zones, as I said, were in the phase of development. They were not fully developed. They had reached the levels of organized units in villages and were moving towards the unification of the command of the Drenica zone. It says gradually these units had started their structuring in military ways, like units and companies, and they were directly linked to the command of the zone. Is that correct?
Po, sakt.
Yes, that's correct.
Moving on to the following transcript page, which is 3277, you specifically described that when you arrived, so I'll quote it, when I arrived in June, this zone was not developed as a zone. There were self-organized units, local staffs, such as the local staff of Malisheva, of not very high military organization level. this zone began to be structured in mid-June. I don't know exactly the date, but I know that during my visits to this zone in this time, I came across many self-organized units and units that were not unified in the command. Do you recall giving that evidence, and is it still accurate?
På.
Yes, it is accurate.
You've obviously talked about Dukajin and Drenica being slightly more advanced, but even with the extreme limitations of that development. But even within those zones, the KLA only had a certain amount of control over territory, didn't they?
Påsagt.
That's correct, yes.
Described it to my colleagues as pockets of territory that they then potentially sought to link up later on. Is that right?
Påsagt.
Yes, that's right.
Before you entered Kosovo, you didn't know the geographical areas of these pockets with any accuracy at all, did you?
Påsagt.
Yes, that's correct.
And just to be clear, this was essentially the case throughout the war, wasn't it? There was pockets or areas of territory held by the KLA within each of the zones. I mean, the zones, well, I'll start again. The zones covered the entire country of Kosovo, didn't they?
Ja, så att
No, the zones were divided territorially, but they did not cover the entire country of Kosovo. They had certain parts under their control, but there were other parts that were under the control of Serbian forces.
But even within the zones that, as they were described on a map, you would only have certain areas of control within those, or pockets of control within those.
på.
Yes.
Initial period when you first arrived, you confirmed to the Haradinaj trial chamber, that's transcript page 3290, that the KLA wasn't a proper army, it was an army under development.
På.
Yes.
Of operations that were launched by the KLA at the time, you explained in your statement to the ICTY and confirmed before the trial chamber in Haradinaj that although in theory the approval of the General Staff was necessary for launching combat operations, in practice this just wasn't happening anywhere in Kosovo. Is that correct?
Påståendet.
Yes, that's correct.
And did that continue largely all throughout the summer, June, July, August, September, and even into October?
På.
Yes, it did.
And was that the case even later than October as well?
På kapasel.
Yes, there were some cases after October as well.
And in terms of communications, again, you confirmed there was no regular communication between the General Staff and the zone commanders or lower levels from May until September. And I'll just quote a part of your Haradinaj evidence, just to be very clear. This is transcript page 3291 in Haradinaj. As far as I remember, from July onwards, there weren't regular communications between the General Staff and zone commanders. And that's right, isn't it?
Påståendet.
Yes, that's right.
And then a bit later on the following page, so that's 3292, you're asked a question. In general, can you please confirm from the end of May to September, there were no regular communication between the four individuals styling themselves members of the General Staff and either the zone commanders or any of those operating at a lower level in the village defences? Your answer, there weren't any regular meetings. Question, and I think communication generally was difficult, wasn't it, between those 4 individuals and any of the commanders? So you asked to repeat the question, and then your answer was yes, it was very difficult to communicate at the time. If you could just confirm that that's still your evidence.
Po.
Yes.
Just one more quote, that's the following page 3293. You stated in relation to the KLA, it wasn't functioning in the proper sense of the word. In normal armies, the general staff would have the possibility to contact the troops and commanders, but this was an army that was still a fledgling army under development, so there wasn't a possibility to do those things. That's still correct, isn't it?
What?
Yes, it is.
Be clear, when you entered Kosovo, end of May, beginning of June, there were still lots of local staffs operating throughout Kosovo. Is that correct?
Po sakt.
Yes, that's correct.
Understand what these local staffs were. Now, they were often based around a village, weren't they?
Po.
Yes.
And they were headed by someone from within the village who has some authority and convinces other individuals within that local unit to take up arms.
Po sakt.
Yes, correct.
Didn't feel the need or any obligation to report to anyone else, did they, in your experience at the time?
Po. Jatko.
Yes, that's correct at the time.
Is it true they often had little military experience or training or knowledge of military operations in any way?
Po. Është sakt.
Yes, correct.
In your SPO interview, you described these local staffs in the following terms, and this is P1355.1, page 32 in the English, and pages 32 to 33 in the Albanian. Then I later on visited other places, other staff, other areas where they had local staff that were uncoordinated, not connected to each other, and had no contact with each other. Everybody was calling themselves a commander and believed to be above everybody else. Is that correct? That's still your evidence?
Po.
Yes, it is.
Was that in most of the different zones you visited at the time?
Po.
Yes.
So, to be clear, there is a very, very real and substantive difference between the organisation of these staffs and an actual functioning military army, military units that you knew from your previous military experience in Bosnia that you talked about earlier.
Po sakt është.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, your role, and we'll get into it more a bit later after the break, when you first arrived, would mean that you would interact with some of these local staffs in your trips around Kosovo. Is that right?
Po, kështu.
That's right, yes.
Role was to provide advice and assistance to them, wasn't it?
Po, kështu është.
Yes, that's right.
Point, and let's be very clear on this, they didn't have to follow what you said.
Po, sakt është.
Yes, this is correct.
They believed what you were suggesting was a good idea, and obviously from your experience, then they may well have done, then they would have followed you, but they didn't have an obligation to do so.
Po.
Yes.
Your Honour, I see it's 11 o'clock, or 1 minute to 11. I think it's a convenient time if we can take the break now.
Fine. Witness will take our 11 o'clock break. We'll be back in a half hour. Please don't speak to anybody about your testimony outside the courtroom. You may leave now with the court usher. We're adjourned until 11:30.
All rise. All rise.
Be seated, please. Madam Court Officer, please bring the witness in. All right, Mr. Zerapi, Mr. Roberts will continue his cross-examination. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Your Honour, and good morning again, Mr. Zerapi.
Medita.
Good morning.
We were talking about local staffs, and I know you confirmed to my colleague, Mr. Mistic, the other day, your previous testimony in Limay that the brigades started to be formed in August '98 and the process continued in September, October and November. Just to remind you of that. So we're looking at that time period, just to orientate you. And I won't address the Thaçi staff that you've obviously already spoken about to Mr. Mistic, but you are aware, aren't you, of the Rahavats local staff?
Po.
Yes.
Staff was created when you were in Albania, so you don't know the process by which it was created or how it was created. Is that right?
Po sakt.
Yes, it is.
The prosecution during your preparation session, that you don't know what the connection was between this local staff, between Drenots and the general staff during the period of June 1998, save that it was being used by general staff members as a base for transit back and forth to Albania. Is that right? That's paragraph 8 of preparation note 1.
Po sakt, kështu e kam.
Yes, that's right. That's what I stated.
Confirmed to the prosecution that when you stopped in Drenots, you spent, I think, 3 days there to help put structures to work and gave instructions to Mahir Hassani on how to set up and structure a battalion, and then it was agreed that Mr. Hassani and I think Yusuf Gashi would stay there. Is that right?
Po, Mahir Hasani dhe
Yes, Mahir Hassani and Binak Gashi, not Yusuf Gashi.
Now, once you'd left Mr. Gashi and Mr. Hassani there, am I right that this local staff basically continued to operate largely independently throughout the rest of June, July and August?
po qëshorit e kurrikut.
Yes, during June and July, yes.
Now, when you first arrived in Drenots, I think you said you met Jem Gashi, but you didn't know his position at the time and only learnt it later on. Was that right?
Po.
Yes.
And Jem Gashi left to Albania at some point later in the year. Do you recall that?
Po, mas.
Yes, it was after this period.
When that was?
Kjo ka ndodhur pas ofensive se
This was after the offensive. I don't know whether it was September or October 1998.
Before the brigade was created in that area?
brigada ka filluar të
The brigade began being formed after the offensive in August. All the local staffs who had come under assault started organizing themselves into a brigade. The process began then, but it was not completed. Its evolution and reorganization continued through September and October up to the period when we returned back.
Am I right that Mr. Gashi, Jem Gashi, Jamal Gashi, didn't become a brigade commander then?
nuk kam kujtuar bash.
I can't recall exactly.
Now, going back to that first trip to Drenots, I think you met Gani Pacharizi, but you didn't know his role or his function at the time. That's what you told the SPO. Is that right?
Po kështu është, sakt.
Yes, correct.
Selim Krasniqi, I think you met on another trip to Drenots, but again, you didn't know his role at the time. Is that correct?
Po sakt.
Yes, correct.
Introduced to you as, and we're talking June here, June 98, as members of the military police, were they?
Jo, në atë kohë.
No, I don't recall them being introduced to me as such then, no.
In fact, were you even aware of the existence of military police units within that local staff?
Nëse më kujtohet, mua s'kam pa polici.
If I remember correctly, I never saw any military police during that period of June, July. There were units of the local staff, but there was no such police that would be noticeable.
You can look at a document that you were shown during your SPO interview, and I'll just give you 2 seconds or a few seconds to familiarize yourself with it. This is P67, and the ERN is SITF 00437785 to SITF 00437792 in English and Albanian, please. Now, I know your interview was several years ago, but you recall looking at this document and discussing it in your SPO interview, is that right?
No, I don't remember.
I can take you to your SPO interview and discuss this, where you, maybe if we can just move through to the next page as well, just so that you can see it on the screen. And then maybe into the last page as well, just for the signature, just so you can get an overview. Does that jog your memory of being shown that document during the SPO interview?
Paul?
Yes.
You said at the outset that you don't know whose the signature is, and you've never received this document before. And for the record, that's P1355.3, pages 8 and 10. That's your SPO interview. Can you just confirm that that's correct?
Correct, yes.
In your SPO interview, you were asked in relation to the first sentence, so if we could just go back, Court Officer, to page 1 of that document. So, on the second paragraph of the text, there's a phrase that says, "So far we have not sent any reports to this staff," open brackets, "with the exception of one that was requested in the case of Rahavats," close brackets. And you told the SPO in relation to that line that you had never seen an earlier report from the Rahavats local staff, and again that you weren't aware that such a report had been drafted. So that's P1355.3, page 11. Do you recall telling that to the SPO?
Yes, correct.
Now, you also told the SPO in relation to Rahavats, in relation to the Rahavats local staff, you didn't receive any subsequent reports from the Rahavats local staff. Again, that's your interview, P1355.3, page 6. So that's right, isn't it? You didn't receive any reports after Rahavats.
Yes, correct.
Your Honor.
Yes.
Could you please invite counsel to also direct me to which part of the SPO interview we're talking about? Because for me it's very hard to follow with only these directions.
I understand.
Please do that.
My apologies. It was part 3, page 6. I'll give the full reference, and I remember Your Honour's indication to do that. I will try and do so later. So yes, part 3, page 6. And just to be clear, Mr. Zarapi, so I'm correct in understanding that your evidence is that you never received an earlier report from the Rahavats local staff, and you never received this report from the Rahavats local staff. And is that correct?
Yes, correct.
This report is, I can tell you, there's no need to look at it. On the last page, it's dated the 15th of August, 1998. And you confirmed, obviously, several times to the panel that you were appointed as the the director or the head of the operations department around the 15th of July, so a month earlier. That's right, wasn't it?
Po ashtu diku.
Yes, thereabouts.
In that position, if this document had been sent to you, you would have expected to receive it.
Po sakt.
That's right.
Do you remember the information that's in the document with any specificity? I understand it's several years ago that you were shown it.
Po.
Yes, it was shown. This document was shown some years ago. However, I would have been aware of this report at the time we're referring to, July, August. We had the Serbian offensive and we had no time to deal with the issues of writing or sending up reports. Secondly, regarding the Rahovets local staff, let me specify that there were two staffs during the offensive of Rahovets. One was in Drenoc, the other one was in Rahovets. And they had no coordination between the two of them, which explains what occurred in July in Rahovets. This document talks about a local Rahovets staff, which does not appear to correspond with the time and with the way events unfolded at that time. That is why I never received such a report at the time, and I have difficulty placing it in time, or placing it within the context of what unfolded at that particular time.
Thank you. In terms of the report itself, again, this second paragraph, it actually appears to be, I'll read it, it says, therefore, feeling ourselves responsible for the tardiness of this report, herewith we are also sending you some information about the work that our unit has done during the time. Do you see that on the end of the second paragraph?
Po?
Yes, I do.
It appears very clear that this isn't a report that in any way has been solicited or requested by you or by other members of the general staff, is it?
Po sakt.
That's right.
And as you explained, obviously, a few moments ago, at that time with the severe Serbian offensive that was going on, this just wouldn't have been the type of thing that you would have requested. There were much more important things to be doing, if I can put it that way.
Po sakt.
That's right.
Content of this report, and it does go on to explain what appears to be a description of what the task or responsibilities and personnel of these individuals has been. This information appears to have been provided to the general staff as if they were completely unaware of it. Does that make sense? I can rephrase my question.
Would you please kindly rephrase it?
So this appears to be, on its face, an explanation of the duties and personnel and individuals and tasks of this self-styled Rahovets local operational staff between the 28th of April 1998, which is the first date there, and the 15th of August 1998. And the suggestion I'm putting to you is that this is all information that appears to be phrased as if it was brand new for the general staff. That they were not aware of this information before the report was drafted.
It is clear that this is a report that describes the activities of this staff from its creation in April to August. And it says here that it's a report during June. The description is to the general staff, and it was not how the staff was described at the time. At the time, it was called the central staff. So this kind of report purports to be describing what this staff did and how it was created. It never reached us at the headquarters. We never had time to deal with these kinds of issues, neither did we solicit it. So I have difficulty commenting on a report that I have neither solicited nor have ever had in my possession.
I won't ask any further questions about it. Just in relation to Binak Gashi, I think you mentioned or corrected that he was left in Drenots when you passed through. And that was because he was originally from the area of Gremnik. I think you said, originally born there, and he knew the people. And that's why he was left there to provide assistance to the Rahavat's local staff. Is that right?
That's right.
Often what happened that people would, when coming into Kosovo, either go to the areas that they knew or stay there because they would be more able to be effective and build any relationships that are necessary within those areas.
Yes, generally speaking, yes.
Just in relation to Mr. Gashi, I presume that was his request or his wish to stay in Drenots then. Is that fair?
Yes, because he came from that territory. I did mention that he came from the area. He knew the territory and the people over there, and the people knew him, and he commanded some authority amongst them.
His wish or his desire to stay there as much as anyone else's suggestion that he should.
Yes, correct.
If we move on to the next topic, which is the operational directorate of the central staff and later the general staff, and exactly what its role was when you entered into Kosovo in June 1998. Now, you started working within this operations department when you arrived, is that right?
Yes.
And we heard earlier about your different roles within the Bosnian army when you were working over there from 92 to 95. And I just want to try and understand what the role of an operations department is, or directorate is, and how that compares between the two. So I think you mentioned earlier you were within, I think, the 7th Corps, was it? As Chief of the Infantry? Of the Bosnian Army, sorry, just to be clear.
Yes.
Did, as you confirmed, have knowledge and experience of the main staff of the Bosnian army?
Po.
Yes.
Equivalent to the operations directorate in the Bosnian army in 1993, for example?
Në vitin 90.
Back then in 1993, the operations directorate within the general staff of the Bosnian army, it was a completely functional unit. The situation was different. There were many superior officers serving in the Bosnian army, people who came from the Yugoslav army. So this directorate was composed of military officers with huge experience, people who had experience in the operational divisions field, and they were the people who were entrusted with this task. This is not a sector that is composed of one single superior officer, but all the military disciplines, chiefs from the military disciplines, and it is this group that takes decisions about defensive, offensive operations, or basically all the activities that are to do with making an army operational to accomplish the missions and the goals that are put before it.
I mean, in simple terms, it's one of the most important directorates of an army, isn't it? The operations directorate of a regular army like the Bosnian army.
Po, sakt.
That's right.
There were lots of, composed of military officers with huge experience. How many people are you talking about within the Bosnian army at that time?
The operational sector was composed of career officers in the numbers of roughly 50 to 60 overall.
Sorry to interrupt. And these are 50 to 60 individuals with extensive military experience who've been training in this role for many, many years. And what rank are those individuals?
Yes. These posts were taken by experienced officers from the grade of major to the general who's in charge of the operations sector.
And they would obviously, I presume, have extensive other administrative support for their work as well.
Yes, definitely.
And without limiting this, they would have their own offices and a headquarters, I presume.
That's right. Each sector had its own offices, operational premises, and the chiefs of every sector as per a normal army.
Extensive communications equipment. Again, I'm talking Bosnian Army 1993, middle of the war. You would have communications equipment allowing you to make contact with all of your units throughout the country, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Maps detailing the terrain, the topography, and the location of both your forces and enemy forces in quite significant detail, I would presume.
Po, sakt.
Yes, correct.
Now, if we compare that to Kosovo in the beginning of June 1998, my understanding at that time is that you had certain groups of fighters placed in pica, in points. Is that right?
Po, saktë.
That's correct.
And obviously, you didn't have a big fixed headquarters with any of the facilities that I just mentioned. None of the communications equipment mapping the whole of Kosovo, no one of the maps, and no real specific idea of the location or amount of forces throughout the country.
Po, saktë.
That's correct, yes.
To be fair, calling this section or this unit or entity an operations directorate is more than a little bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?
Po, për atë kohë.
Yes, for the time we're speaking about, yes.
Yes, and I'm talking June and up until the time that you became the the chief of operations around the 15th of July. So that's what these questions are focusing on. To be clear, the operations director at the time appeared to consist of Mr. Salimi, Mr. Bashota, you, and Mr. Chelai. Is that essentially correct? Sorry, Agim Chelai.
Po, saktë.
That's correct.
All of you four was to visit different local staffs on the ground, to try and gain some knowledge of their composition, what resources they had, and trying to assist them and advise them, as you've said.
Po, saktë.
Yes, that's correct.
Change much at all up until the 15th of July? Was there a dramatic change between those 6 weeks period? Or was it essentially a similar number of personnel and your role over that time until you took over?
Po, saktë.
This is correct. There was no dramatic changes because when we speak of 15th of July, the Serb offensives began and then Rahovec, so we didn't have the opportunity to develop this directorate. However, we did what we could to the extent it was possible to our abilities to help and assist the staffs in the subzones at the time, including local staffs.
And to be clear, it's none of my questions are in any way meant as any criticism of what you achieved in that time. It's just trying to present a realistic understanding of what the situation was in Kosovo and what the situation was for you and your colleagues within that department. Now, in mid-July, you told the trial chamber in Milutinovic, so this is P1356 for the record, at transcript page 6017, that the KLA held up to about 50% of the territory of Kosovo. Is that right? At the time, so this is mid-July.
If we take into consideration the central part, Drenica was for the major part under the control of KLA, including part of Pastrik area. Maybe this percentage is a bit exaggerated, but quite a large portion of the territory was under the control of the KLA.
To 40%, that would also be realistic or reasonable?
Yes.
The summer offensive, you mentioned it a few moments ago, happened after Rahovac. it was very difficult for KLA units to defend this territory, wasn't it?
Po, me fillimin e ofensivës,
Yes, with the commencement of the offensive, it became very difficult to protect and defend the territory and to maintain the local units that had been formed.
So difficult.
vështirë ishte se
It was difficult because, as we explained earlier, the system was not developed, militarily speaking. They were in the fledgling phase. The restructuring into brigades began, but was not completed, and there were attacks by the Serb forces. And of course, it was impossible to achieve all this. These were the reasons that I've already mentioned before.
Even though they had control over territory, it was very tenuous, and when the FRY, when the Yugoslav forces attacked, it was very difficult for you to defend against that. But you had made efforts in those 6-week period between early June up until, say, Rahovac, up until mid-July. You'd made efforts to try and strengthen defences. Is that fair?
po.
Yes.
Expecting a Yugoslav attack at that point or at some point over the summer? Was that at the forefront of your mind from a military perspective?
Ajo veç ka ndodhur prej
That had already happened beginning with Rahovac. The attacks continued by the Serb military and police forces up to October.
For Rahovac, when you first arrived into Kosovo, that 6-week period between early June and mid-July, over that time, you were expecting the Yugoslav forces to launch an offensive against the KLA. Is that fair?
unë
I explained earlier and said that Dresnica and Dugagini zones were active. When I say active, I mean in the combat aspect, because there was fighting with the Serb forces in these territories. And that is why we always anticipated attacks, and we always had to be prepared and ready to defend the territory.
Trying to get to is the focus of the operations directorate, and I would suggest that at the time quite a lot of your focus was on advising these units that you go and see on how to defend themselves if the Serb forces did launch their attack. Is that fair?
po, është e shkurt.
Yes, it's clear and it is fair.
In terms of operations that happened during that period, the only one really that I understand took place was the Belećevac mine fighting. And you discussed this in your SBO interview, so I'll just explain what you said there. That you went to Belećevac right at the end when everything had finished, and you don't remember a lot about it. And for the record, that's your SBO interview part 2, page 20, P1355.2. And that was right, isn't it, that you don't remember much about that at all?
Shqiptimi i emrit fshatit është
The pronunciation of the name of the village is Belačevc. It's a mine. This is correct, and I remember this when it happened and when I went there. It is correct.
Yes, apologies for my poor pronunciation. And you also told the SPO I'll just get the reference. This is your part 2, page 22, your SPO interview. So again, P1355.2. That when you arrived, the deputy commander of the Shala operational zone told you which unit had participated. And according to what the deputy commander told you, the attack was led by the unit commander. You can't remember the name now. It was a smaller, lower unit. I can't remember the name now. And that's all still correct. That's all still your evidence, isn't it?
Yes, it's correct.
Clear, this wasn't an operation that you, within the operations directorate, had planned, authorized, or sanctioned in any way at all, was it?
No, it wasn't authorized.
So I think stated in your SPO interview that you didn't believe it served a military purpose either.
That's correct, yes.
And in terms of, if I can use the term, offensive operations, is that the only substantial offensive operation that occurred in the period between early June and mid-July? Up until Rahavats, I mean.
As far as I remember, Rahovets happened first, and then this one. But this is not of any importance. What is important is that they happened. They were not approved by the staff. Rather, they were approved by the local staffs, which proceeded with them without prior approval.
Yes, thank you. Now, just in terms of the operational department's responsibilities, the operational directorate at that time. Now, in your SPO interview, you were very clear that prisoners, or the issue of prisoners, were not part of the competence of the operational directorate. And you had a discussion about prisoners who were supposedly taken during the operation we were just talking about in Badi Mard. So this is again your interview, part 2, P1355.2, page 23. You were asked, did you learn whether prisoners were taken during that operation? Your answer, from what I remember, I didn't receive any information from the deputy commander. At the time, my position was to deal only with military operational issues. So that's what you told the SPO. So just to be absolutely clear, is your evidence that military operations department would not have any role in relation to prisoners who were taken during fighting?
Yes, that's right.
And this is the same regardless of the nature of the individuals taken, whether it would be soldiers or civilians. It's just not the role of the operations department. Is that fair?
Yes, that's right.
And you're speaking in relation to the whole of the directorate, the whole of the operations directorate, not just you personally at that time.
Yes, correct, in general.
Explain why that's the case. Why is it not the role of the operations department?
The role and competencies of the operational directorate, as I said earlier, is not to deal with such matters. Its main concerns are operations, the organization of the units, their preparation, and to organize attacks or defense. To organize operations, both from operational and strategic point of view. Whatever happens within an area, like prisoners of war and so forth, that is under the commander of the zone where that occurred. It's not the duty of the operations directorate to deal with prisoners of war. It's the legal department that deals with such matters and the relevant command of the territory where such occurrences happen.
And that authority over prisoners of war, under the commander of the zone where that occurred, did that continue throughout the entire conflict? That didn't change, did it?
That's correct.
If we can move on now, it overlaps with the operations department, but in relation to your role and authority within the period 1st June up till mid-July, and then afterwards, after the 15th of July. So when you arrived into Kosovo, you told the panel last week on the 3rd of July that you occupied the position of Officer for Development and Training within the Operational Directorate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I'd like to just go over what you said about Mr. Salimi and Mr. Bashota and your interactions with them in your SBO interview and also before the panel, because you describe those interactions in June 1998. So first of all, your SBO interview part 2, page 3, so that's P1355.2. And I'll just read out what you said. Question, if I may ask, when you say, did the general staff member come with you there or was there? Answer, I think he was there actually. When I was called, and it was Sokol Bashota, because at the time he was heading the operational department directory, and I was under him. He would issue orders to me. He then sent me there. I don't remember everybody who was there, but it was him. So I apologize for the slightly convoluted nature of the question, but your evidence saying in relation to Mr. Bashota, at the time he was heading the operational department directory and I was under him, he would issue orders to me. Is that correct?
I think it would be fair to give the witness the time period in the incident.
Well, I think there's cross-examination or re-examination for...
Go ahead, overruled.
Thank you.
Well, for that period, yes.
Period, this is June 1998, is that right?
Yes, June 1998.
Took over on the 15th of July 1998, or round about the 15th of July.
Yes.
You also told the SPO, this is part 2, page 7, and you were asked, so you met Sokol Bashota. How did he introduce himself to you? Who did you understand him to be? Your answer, he introduced me. He introduced himself to me as being the director of the operational department directory of the General Staff. Now, do you recall that evidence and is it still accurate?
Yes, I recall it very well and it is still accurate.
Thank you. Now, you told the court on the 1st of July 2024 that Mr. Bashota was the first person to give you an order to go to Drenica, and then later it was Recep Salimi. Do you recall giving that testimony?
Yes.
directed to your previous testimony in Haradinaj to refresh your memory, and then pointed to the exchange. And I'll read it out. So this is the transcript of the 1st of July 2024, and the reference is transcript page 17345. So that's Miss Lawson reading out, and can we go to page 757 in both, please? Question, I'm going to read from lines 2 to 7 in the Albanian. You say, this is referring to your previous evidence in Haradinaj. I cannot recall exactly how long I stayed. Was it 2 or 3 days? I don't know, but it was a very brief period. After which, pursuant to the orders issued by the operational commander at the time, Recep Selimi, I was tasked with a duty to go to the operational zone of Drenica in order to render my advice for the development of the operational zone of Drenica. Is that accurate, witness? Your answer that you gave in court on the 1st of July. Yes, it's correct. Both Recep Selimi and Sokol Bashota were at the operational directorate. I remember that the first one that instructed me when I went on the ground to Drenica was Sokol Bashota, and later on Recep Selimi. So just you remember that exchange and what you answered to the question from the prosecutor. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What you said in court on the 1st of July, that's consistent with what you'd previously told the SPO, isn't it? That Mr. Bashota introduced himself and acted as the head of the operations directorate and first instructed you to go to Drenica.
Yes.
Later on, that Mr. Selimi also asked or instructed you to go to Drenica as well, on a separate occasion.
Yes.
Selimi asked or instructed you to go to Drenica. It was the same reason that Mr. Bashota had previously ordered you to go there, wasn't it? To provide assistance and advice. It wasn't anything different.
Yes.
So am I correct in understanding that what Mr. Selimi was doing was essentially repeating what Mr. Bashota had already done?
Yes, correct.
And did Mr. Selimi refer to Mr. Bashota's previous instruction or order when he sent you to Drenica?
Yes.
Now, you met Mr. Selimi for the first time in early June in 1998. Now, that meeting, as I understand it, it wasn't in Likots itself, it was in a family house. Is that right?
Yes, it was in a house.
And again, apologies in advance for my pronunciation, but was it in a place called Plugin? So not exactly in Likots.
Yes, the village of Plugin.
Now, when Mr. Selimi met you, he didn't introduce himself with a specific position. He just told you that he was in the operations directorate or department. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Told, I think, the SPO that Agim Chelai, Agim Chelai was also part of that directorate. Did he join at the same time as you, or was he there before?
At the same time as me.
And what was Mr. Chelai's position? Was he equivalent or the same as you, or was it a slightly different role he was performing?
Da, este
He was a former military officer as well, and he too worked as an officer for development. He was later assigned to train and prepare soldiers, especially the rapid intervention units. So he started training these units. These were his tasks and what he did, Mr. Chelai.
He continued in that role the whole of the time until he unfortunately passed away was killed in mid-July. Is that right?
Posakt.
That's right, yes. Not only in mid-July, well, yes, that's correct. In Rahovec.
My apologies, I spoke over you, but yes, in Rahovec, it was where he was killed. Now, you further explained to the SPO that when you could, in this time, in June and into July, you were accompanied by Mr. Salimi into the areas that you would go and visit to provide advice and assistance. Now, am I correct in understanding that was you who requested him to come, or how did that happen?
That's correct. We went together because Mr. Selimi knew everybody and was familiar with the villages, with the units. I was not familiar with all of them, and people didn't know me either. So that's why, together with Mr. Selimi, we visited these units. We went to all the zones. He introduced me, and we rendered our advice in all the zones that we visited at the time.
Amy was more than happy to go with you, wasn't he? He thought that would be helpful and useful.
Yes, we were together all the time.
Together, didn't you? Even if you came from quite different backgrounds, if I can say, you developed a very good working relationship together.
Yes, that's correct.
You, I think, just mentioned before, obviously, a lot of the local people in the areas that you visited didn't know you, and I think you mentioned earlier, obviously, you'd been out of the country for a long period, for 20 or so years. So Mr. Salimi coming with you and speaking to them, that helped you to carry out your job, didn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And in your interactions with people, along with Mr. Salimi, he was liked and trusted by those people around?
You could see that they knew each other and that they trusted him.
And did he have a certain amount of legitimacy, if I can use that expression, because of the role that he'd been playing and his role in announcing, for example, the public announcement of the KLA in November 1997?
That's correct, yes.
His proximity to Adam Yashari and the relationship and the long-standing relationship of trust that they had developed, that also helped in terms of his relationship with other people.
Yes.
He was out with you and providing this advice and assistance. He wasn't barking orders at anyone, was he?
Correct.
Providing advice and assistance and trying to, if I can use the expression, convince these local staff people that the advice that you were giving from your military experience is advice that they should follow.
Posakt.
Correct, yes.
As you confirmed earlier, they were obviously under no obligation to do so. So you benefited from having someone who could almost lay the groundwork for you, if I can use that expression, to convince these individuals that actually, yes, what you're saying is militarily a sensible thing to do.
Posakt.
Correct, yes.
And what was Mr. Bashotta at the time? He would come out with you less often, is that right? Was he more based back in somewhere else?
Posakt.
That's correct, yes.
And then you would report back to Mr. Bashotta in that period up until mid-July as to how successful you had been and maybe who you had met and what you had achieved over that period.
Po.
Yes.
Now, you also, I believe, explained that you you told the SPO, and this is part 2, page 11, that as well as your duty of advising and assisting these local units, you would also advise people who could potentially be appointed, and that you would send your proposals up to Azam Sula via either Recep Salimi or Sokol Bashotta. Do you remember saying that to the SPO?
Po. So.
Yes, correct.
So explained in your preparation session to the SPO, so that's P1357, paragraph 12, that once you made these recommendations, you weren't part of any subsequent discussions or communications, and you don't know who ultimately made the decision to appoint any individual. Is that right?
Posakt.
That's correct, yes.
To your recollection, your proposals were followed, weren't they?
Po.
Yes, they were.
Now, in your SPO interview, you described several organizational issues, if I can use that expression, in the summer of 1998, where Mr. Bashotta would call you and task you to go to a particular place. Now, I think you, for example, went to Drenots to mediate the issues between local staffs in Drenots. Do you recall that?
Po.
Yes.
And you also told the SPO about being tasked by Mr. Bashotta to go to the Prizren local staff and to help them go and reorganize that. And I'll just quote from your interview, that's P1355.2, your part 2 of your interview, page 13. States, I'll do the full paragraph. There was one person. There would then be the liaison with the Pastric operational zone. This is how I understood it at the time. These 3 people, Zafir, Elbasan Shoshai, and Ismet Kriyeju, came from this part through the Pastric operational zone to Sokol Bashotta. They asked a system in order for them to reorganize the local staff of Prizren. Sokol Bashotta then called me. He called me and he tasked me to go to Prizren local staff, help them and reorganize the Prizren local staff. Do you remember telling the SPO that?
Posakt ashtu është.
Yes, that's correct.
They also sent you, I believe, to Drenots, is that right, to mediate the issue there?
Po.
And in both those circumstances, the local staffs had requested him to send someone, and then he sent you. Is that your understanding?
Po, ashtu mendoj.
Yes, that's what I think.
Point, it was you imposing your will or the will of the operational director on those units. It was them coming to you and you providing a solution, a possible solution that they could follow or not. But fortunately, they did follow it, I presume.
Po, ashtu është.
That's right, yes.
Now, you told the panel on the 3rd of July, so that was your third day of testimony last week, that Mr. Salimi was present in Kosovo during June and July 1998. Do you recall telling that?
Po.
Yes, I do.
Now, you described a meeting, which I won't go into, but on the 26th of June 1998 in Suareka, which you I think confirmed you attended, when the Cheliku 50 and the Lisi units decided to merge. You remember that, don't you?
Po.
I do.
And Mr. Salimi wasn't at that meeting, was he?
Jo, nuk ka qenë.
No, he was not.
You know why he wasn't?
Jo, për arsye.
No, I don't. Because when I wanted to help these two units to join up, I was accompanied by Mr. Bashota, who told me that there were some issues amongst these local units, and that is why I went there. We talked to those units, helping them to get together. There was another individual, Ghafor El Shani, who also comes from the Suharek territory, and he was well familiar with both units, the Chadiku and the Lisi, and he'd been involved with the prior organization of the local units of the KLA there. He had his authority, so in a way we pooled our authorities together in order to make it possible for those two units to join.
Apologies if you've already answered this, but they'd requested, again, this is another example of them requesting you to go and help them just by your presence.
Po, sakt.
Yes, correct.
Suggest that the reason that Mr. Salimi wasn't at that meeting at the end of June was that he was on his way or had already arrived in Albania. Would that be consistent with your recollection?
Mund me qenë edhe ajo, po.
It may well be possible, but I did not see him after that meeting. I was given another task to perform in the Prizren territory.
Go on to Rahavats a bit later and possibly tomorrow, but just in that intervening period, do you remember when you next saw him? Was it at Rahavats or was it before that?
Po, në Ravec.
Yes, in Rahovets. I saw him earlier, before Rahovets, when we went on a visit to Dukajin. And I saw him again in Rahovets later.
When you say earlier to Dukajin, is that round about the 14th or 15th of July? And I understand that dates, it's not always so easy.
Po datat jo fort, po di që
I can't remember the dates, but I know that it was 3 days before the Rahovets assault began. That's when we were in Dukajin. the time when the meeting at the Yablonets was mentioned earlier.
Yes, I think that was questions from Mr. Emerson. And so, am I right that you don't recall seeing Mr. Salimi between, say, the date of this meeting in relation to the Lisi unit on the 26th of June, and then that meeting on the 14th or 15th of July? You don't recall seeing Mr. Salimi then?
Ja, nuk më kujtohet.
I don't recall, no.
Now, back to early June, when you first met Mr. Salimi, you told the SPO, and I want to be very clear exactly what you told them, that you thought that at the time, Recep Salimi was the operations commander. And I'll just actually read the quote, so to be very clear for you. So this is part 2, P1355.2, page 8. Now, question, and did you understand Recep Salimi? Let me ask you, who did you understand to be the operational commander at the time? And your answer, at the time, I thought it was Recep. Do you recall telling the SPO that?
Mund më konë, po
It may be possible, however, I did not say commander because there was no such commander. There was an operations directorate, and there were two people who served there, Sokol and Recep.
Well, that's meant that I haven't got to ask the next 3 or 4 questions because, yes, very clear there was no such role as operations commander, and indeed it never existed, did it, in that terminology?
po ashtu është.
That's right.
Evidence, as I understand it, is that Mr. Salimi was in the operations department at that time. Mr. Bashota was the head of the operations department, and you were also in the department.
Po qartë.
Yes, it's clear. I think I explained it earlier as well.
You, moving on now to round about 15th of July, on the 1st of July, sorry, that should be 1st of July 2024, this is transcript page T17369, you explained that you were informed you were head of the operational directorate sometime in the middle of July, 3 or 4 days before the offensive in Rahavats. And I think you confirmed that again on the 3rd of July. And now you just obviously explained about the meeting that you were at in Yablonitsa a couple of days before Rahavats, and that appears to be the time that you took over as head of the operational directorate. Is that correct?
Po, kështu është po pak.
Yes. However, the date of 3 July, I don't know what kind of relationship it has with the Yablonitsa meeting. Maybe there's an issue of translation here.
In lack of clarity, I meant that you gave evidence here the 3rd of July 2024. You confirmed that fact. I should have done the year, so yes. I hope that's clear now. But yes, you took over mid-July, 14th or 15th.
Po, qartë.
That's right.
Did you effectively assume Mr. Bashota's responsibilities and duties?
Po.
Yes.
And what did Mr. Bashota go on and do at that stage?
Nuk e di.
I don't know. I wasn't even aware of the structure of the staff at the time. But as a matter of fact, because of the offences that were ongoing, it was impossible for us to be aware of the toing and froing in terms of posts and positions. When the restructuring was completed, then we learned that he had been appointed to Deputy Commander for Operations.
Yes, and that was much later in 1998.
Po saktë.
Right.
July, August, you know your own position because you'd been appointed, but there was a lot of ambiguity about who else was in what other else position across the general staff.
Po saktë.
That's right.
Ambiguity, even obviously for yourself as the Chief of Staff, did that continue up until you left for Albania in I believe, mid-September?
Po diku fillimit
Yes, I left sometime in the beginning of September, but it continued. That continued, yes. That continued until we returned from Albania in November, when the restructuring work for the general staff began.
From November, that you were very clear as to what positions were being occupied, but up until that time, it was much more complicated and difficult to know exactly who was in what position.
po saktë.
That's right.
Just one question. What was Mr. Salimi's attitude towards your appointment in this position? Was he supportive of your appointment as Chief of Staff?
Po.
Yes.
We discussed earlier the positive working attitude relationship that you developed up until then. Did he also have that positive attitude towards Mr. Celai, who you mentioned being responsible for the battalion and for training, I believe?
Po, përgjes për stërvitin. Po.
Yes, he was responsible for training, and yes.
And yes, Mr. Salimi had a good relationship with him.
Po, e që ka po thash.
Correct, that's what I said.
His military background and experience and what he could bring to the KLA.
Po.
Yes.
I believe you told the SPO that he was killed in battle around Rahavats in mid-July, and about how you, Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Salimi, went to the lap zone in August 1998 because you had received information about Mr. Celai being injured and located in a hospital in Pristina. Is that right?
Po, kështu është saktë.
Yes, that's correct.
This was the primary purpose for your trip via the lap zone into Pristina, wasn't it? Or the primary purpose for Mr. Thaçi and Mr. Salimi anyway, I mean.
Po saktë.
That's correct, yes.
And so the lap zone headquarters, or where they went to on the way, that was north of Pristina, though, wasn't it? So why would they go that way to get into Pristina? Why couldn't they just have gone straight into Pristina?
Për arsye se
It's because the LAP zone had its own soldiers in Pristina and had this territory under control. Secondly, they knew that territory very well, and they had the entry points under control. It wasn't possible for us to go to Pristina from Drenica because we did not have any of the lines of movement and entry points under control. From the LAP zone, though, yes, we did have control of some routes, yes.
That Mr. Salimi could conceivably get into Pristina to see if this information was correct, was via the LAP zone.
That's right.
So still exceptionally risky, though, wasn't it, to enter Pristina for Mr. Salimi, whose face was potentially recognisable in the middle of August 1998?
Yes, that risk existed for everyone, regardless of the fact that that passage was under some control and the entry was organized. However, the risk was always present.
And if Mr. Salimi had been captured by the large number of Serb forces in Pristina at the time, what would have happened to him?
He would either have been arrested or killed.
To find Mr. Celai, who worked with you in the operations department, this risky mission, if I can use that term.
Yes, correct.
Now, just back to June and July before you took over, I think you told the SPO that you'd heard about a pocketbook that had been given to Mr. Salimi by the Red Cross, by the ICRC, which he then provided to some of these local commanders on the ground.
Yes, that's right.
This had happened before you entered Kosovo, hadn't it? Before May the 28th.
It's either before I came to know about it or was given the task.
And do you know who these were given to, or in which zones, or any other information about this pocketbook?
No, I don't. It's only what I've been told. I asked Zoti Recepi. He told me that he had distributed it, but I did not ask about who to or what zones it was sent to.
Now, obviously, once you're appointed as the Chief of Staff in mid-July, you are facing mid-July 1998. You take up this role in mid-July 1998. You're facing a very, very difficult challenge because of the Serb offensive that is going on all around.
Yes, that's right. First of all, I wasn't Chief of Staff but head of the Operations Directorate. It was difficult because 2 or 3 days after being given that task, the offensives began, and it did not stop until the month of October. So it wasn't easy, and this does not apply to myself only, but to anyone who would have been given this task. So the operations directorate wouldn't have been able to work better as a result of the offensives that were ongoing.
My apologies, that was a slip of the tongue. I meant head of the operations directorate in mid-July. And so you had the Serb offensive going on July, August, September into October. You had presumably at that time various soldiers who had been killed, other soldiers who had returned back to their countries of origin or where they were living anyway. Is that right?
Po, ashtu është.
Yes, correct.
You had shortages of weapons and ammunition at the time?
Po, sakt.
That's right.
You were completely outgunned in the sense that the Serb forces had hugely superior levels of artillery and tanks and everything else that you would need in terms of fighting a modern war.
Po, sakt.
That's right, yes.
This backdrop that you were trying to introduce your restructuring, trying to see to what extent these local staff units, who had a lot of, local staff units that we talked about earlier, into some form of a more recognizable military structure.
Po, ishte përpjekjet e të shkojmë.
Yes, our goal was to be able to restructure and make it more operational.
And it was far from an easy task because of all of these factors that I was just talking about.
Po, sakt.
That's right, yes.
It's clear that obviously Mr. Chelai had been killed. Mr. Bashota, you said you weren't sure about, so presumably you didn't have much contact with him in the operationals directorate over July, August and September. Was this the time that you requested other people to come and join the operations directorate? I think you mentioned this in court last week.
Po, sakt. Ashtu është.
Yes, that's right, yes.
This when was it named Maloku who was able to join but others weren't, or was it someone else? I can't quite remember.
Koha unë që kom kërku ka që...
When I made my request was in July, then August came. However, Naim Malok was the only one to arrive at the end of August and beginning of September. He was the only officer to come and serve in the operations department, no one else.
So essentially by the end of September you've gone from what were 4 people at the beginning down to maybe 2 or 3 within the operationals directorate.
Po.
Yes.
And before we break for the day, am I right that throughout your entire time in the KLA, you never actually received an official rank?
Jo vetëm unë, po as.
There were no official ranks, and not only for me, but for everyone else. There was no grading system.
Yes, and that obviously was a directly contrasted with the Bosnian army, where you ended as, I believe, a lieutenant colonel. Was that right?
Po.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zarapi. That ends my questions for the day, and I will see you again, hopefully after a restful afternoon, bright and early tomorrow morning. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr. Zarapi, for being with us today. This is the end of your day here. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Remember not to speak to anyone about your testimony outside of the courtroom. If somebody does try to talk to you, be sure to report that to us immediately. We wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Your Honour. In relation to where we are at the moment with this witness, I think it would be helpful at some point soonish to have a realistic discussion as to who's going to come, if anyone else, next week. And obviously, in terms of if that is the case, the earlier we get that information, the better, so that we can plan ahead. At the moment, we understand there are several witnesses potentially scheduled for next week. I'm not obviously going to mention any of them now. Each one of them could require significant work, so the earlier we can have that discussion, the better.
Do we have that information at all?
Well, Your Honour, we were hoping to see where we were at the end of the day tomorrow and then raise it as necessary.
Let's try to get that by the end of tomorrow then. That's a good plan, and you'll have that information far enough ahead of time you can make some plans.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you all for being here. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. We will have a full day tomorrow, is my understanding.
All rise.